Is it growing increasingly likely the Bucks roster just is what it is? We're going to dig into the cap sheet for all teams across the league. What's open in terms of roster spots, who has to cut, who has to add, and how the tax and aprons weigh into all of it coming up next.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, and today's episode, a bit of a primer for part two that Camille is going to join me for, where we take a look at some potential contracts and ideas of what the Bucks may look to do here to trim down their roster to 15. But for this one, I wanted to set the table for that show and just bring us up to speed on where we are league-wide in terms of the open roster spots, who is up against it in terms of where they are hard capped, how close they are to the tax, and some other things. We've kind of talked about potential trades for the Bucks to make or ways to trim the roster down to 15. But as we'll get into here, it's going to be tough to do it. And the closer that we're getting to the end of summer here, the more realistic it's becoming that there just is no other move or moves on the horizon. And we've talked about the easiest way for the Bucks to get down to 15 as that pertains to Karis LeVert and Pete Nance, and that may be the most likely route that the Bucks end up taking here. So again, we're going to have a second show coming out here shortly that Camille is going to join me on. This one, for those of you that are listening to the podcast, is going to be very visual focused. So my apologies in advance there. You may want to look at the YouTube video to follow along, but I've put together a spreadsheet here. So for those of you video, we'll take a look at that now. So we've broken this out. I've broken this out to how the league is currently structured. And teams that are facing no hard cap restrictions whatsoever, teams, as you can see, it's about 2/3 of the league that is hard capped at the first apron, and then 4 teams that are currently hard capped by the second apron here. So let's start with the teams not facing any hard cap restrictions. The Brooklyn Nets are one of those teams, and Brooklyn is the only team in this scenario that is basically free to do anything. Now, they do have full roster at 15, but what I mean by that is the other teams that, 6 of them right now that are not hard capped, they are over the cap, over the first apron, and or out of any room before they go into the luxury tax. The Raptors are a bit of a caveat here, as you'll see the note down there. They have 13 players currently. They are not hard capped, but if and when the Kawhi Leonard trade goes through, the Raptors will be hard capped at the first apron, and I believe they'll just be under the first apron with the salaries going out and coming in that deal. So Denver needs to add, I believe, one more. I don't think this is taking into account DeMar DeRozan. But Denver could add one more. They don't have to get to 15. But as you can see, they have no cap space. Any move that they make, if they were going to pull off a trade here, they can't make a deal, barring them trading someone like Jamal Murray. They cannot make a deal that is going to trigger that first apron hard cap because of where they are and how much money they would have to shed there. New Orleans, similar thing, and that's an interesting one because we've started to hear reporting now in the last 24 hours or so that New Orleans is could be the likely landing spot for Benedict Mathurin. They would have to work on a separate deal to send out some money because they are already over the first apron and would be hard capped there. in a sign and trade. The Knicks are pretty well set, so not much wiggle room that they could do in terms of a move. Oklahoma City, same story there. Doesn't really concern them. There's no real need to spend any time in them. Or Orlando as well. I think you're going to run this out there with Sean Sweeney and the group that you have to see, okay, now under a fresh coat of paint, a new set of eyes, a new head coach. If it didn't work out, now we'll explore if we have to, breaking up Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner. And then we already touched on the Raptors. Have about $2.5 million under that first apron. If the Kawhi Leonard deal does not go through for some reason, by all accounts, it seems like it will, that's going to remove them from this category and shoot them over into the first apron hard-capped teams. So when you look at this collection of teams, and let's just remove Toronto too, since we all think that deal is going to go through, 6 of the 30 teams are not hard-capped at all. But only one of them can actually do something with that in terms of Brooklyn if they wanted to turn 2 into 1 or something like that and bring back some more salary. They've got quite a bit of wiggle room, as you'll see. Brooklyn, $48.9 million that they have under that first apron if they were to make a move or pull off a sign and trade and do anything to trigger that first apron hard cap where you're bringing back more salary in a deal than you're sending out. So of this group, Brooklyn is really the only team that could do something. Again, Denver, I suppose, and we're hearing New Orleans. There's going to have to be a corresponding move that New Orleans makes in a Benedict Mathurin sign and trade. But in the case of Denver, they would have to offload significant money based on where they are up against that first apron. And the taxes, it's the tax. It depends on the owner and really the outlook of the team too, depending on where you're going to slot in your conference, if it's worth it to, in the case of Denver, continue to be in that repeater tax or trigger re-entering that as well. And as we touched on, I think Oklahoma City, Orlando, and New York, they're pretty well set where they are, that you would just look to add a minimum contract, if anything. So I don't expect much with those teams that in theory have the most wiggle room, but again, the asterisk applied, you don't really when it comes to Denver and potentially New Orleans and the rest of that group. All the way over on the other end here is the teams that are currently hard capped by the second apron, to which there is 4. Now, these figures don't include a few things I'll get to primarily with the first apron teams, but in the case of the Warriors, it doesn't include the 2 moves that they just made in terms of how much wiggle room they have. The league subsidizes minimum deals for veterans. So I believe this is going to slot them with, I don't know, like $900K or so below the second apron yet. And then the tax for a team like the Warriors, it is what it is. Of these teams, the Houston Rockets are the only one that really has a lot of room to do something, where you can see they're not even in the tax. They are hard capped at the second apron, but they still have $26 million to play with to get there. So Houston could be a team that says, we'll take on just for the purpose of this exercise, we can take AJ Green, right? It would give us more shooting. We can take on that $10+ million, and we're still comfortably under the second apron, and we would be at 14 guys. We can even add a 15th. So that's the only reason why I mentioned AJ Green, just for the purpose of that example. But of the second apron teams, there's really only one that can do something here. Timberwolves, Jonathan Kuminga is their target. It's the minimum that they can get to, and they got to do some work there as well with Jonathan Kuminga. And then Phoenix, they're already at 15. They have a little bit more wiggle room. They're essentially done. You get the impression in the offseason here. So second apron teams and no hard cap teams. You got one in each category that I really think could do something. Houston remains to be seen. I don't anticipate Brooklyn to do anything. And then again, Denver, this isn't including DeMar DeRozan, so they don't technically have to add, but their move would just be continuing to shed salary for the Denver Nuggets. So that's the outlook currently for those teams that find themselves in the no hard cap and then second apron hard cap. 2/3 of the league is hard cap by the first apron. So we'll run through that set of teams. The Bucks are one of them, and then go a little deeper into what is actually out there in terms of open jobs and money to be spent, as we just showed you against the tax under the aprons. But what about exceptions, trade, mid-level, taxpayer mid-level, all of those that are open for teams? I put that together for every single team and bucket them into the categories of what they have as well. Run through all those things coming up next. First, we talk to you about our friends at Indeed, as support for today's show comes from Indeed Sponsored Jobs. When workplace chaos hits and you need the right hire, Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps connect employers with candidates who match specific needs like skills, certifications, and location. So less time gets spent searching and more time gets spent finding the right fit. People are finding quality hires on Indeed right now. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. And usually, the biggest difference isn't someone doing more work, somebody that knows how to get that work done quicker, more efficiently, smoother. The old adage that we always hear of work smarter, not harder. It's more applicable now than ever before. So spend less time searching, more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes, meaning less time and more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. All right, let's get back into it here. And as I mentioned, 2/3 of the league is hard capped at the first apron. So you can see the Hawks, Celtics, Hornets, Bulls, Cavs, the entire Central Division, Mavs, Pistons, Pacers, Clippers, Lakers, Grizzlies, Heat, the Bucks, Sixers, Blazers, Kings, Spurs, Jazz, and Wizards. And then the Raptors are likely to be in that category as well. So, and again, I encourage you, if you're listening to the show, to seek it out on YouTube so you can follow along here. But I've put together how much room you have under the first apron. And then this is where the tax room is more applicable because of how close the luxury tax and the first apron are. We've talked about it with the Bucks. You have room under the first apron. But how much room you have under the luxury tax in the case of teams like the Bucks, you would think teams like the Sacramento Kings, like the Wizards, like the Charlotte Hornets, that's the figure to pay more attention to, because does it make sense for us to be a luxury tax paying team is the question that most teams are going to ask. And outside of the elite teams, the answer is resoundingly becoming more and more no across the board. So tax room is probably the most important column and figure to keep an eye on with these teams. Let's look at the Bucks. Now, for your apron totals, likely bonuses and non-likely bonuses count towards that. So if you've added up the salaries on the Bucks and said, well, wait a minute, if the first apron figure is what I believe $209 million. The Bucks have less than, what would that be, $191 million on their cap sheet. So how are you getting it's only 18.5? Because the non-likely bonuses and likely bonuses count towards your salary cap, your apron figures here. There's about $6 million, I believe, that the Bucks have there. Kyle Kuzma has, I believe, a $2.6 million non-likely bonus. Tyler Hero has one, and I forget who has another one that's about $600,000 or $700,000. But that's why the figure is probably less room than you may have seen if you've added up. Here's what the Bucks cap sheet actually is. So the more important figure for the Bucks again is not necessarily how much wiggle room they have under the first apron. It's the luxury tax. So they have $15.4 million under the tax. How they can get to that, we'll get to in just a second here in the other tab that I've put together. But as you can see, it's 2/3 of the league that is sitting here hard capped at the first apron. And a decent chunk of them have quite a bit of wiggle room. So who are the teams that could be most active here or say we got something that we can do? Atlanta and Charlotte would be two of the more interesting teams, but they have to reduce the size of their roster. And Charlotte has among the most money they could take on. Same story with Memphis. As you can see, under the first apron, they have nearly $75 million and $65 million below the tax, but they're already 4 over the maximum roster size. So they've got to trim down their roster as well. Wizards, the other interesting team they could add. Who knows how competitive they truly expect to be. So we'll file them away in a separate bucket of will they do something with this. The two teams that you see in asterisk I applied to here, the Mavs and the Heat, that's because of Klay Thompson. I haven't seen the exact figure on what to the dollar his buyout was. So just a projection of the figure roundly that we heard he gave back. That's how we came to, not down to the dollar. And you're just seeing roughly $6 million under the apron for Miami, roughly $2 million before or over the luxury tax. And for Dallas, roughly $10 million to work with under the first apron and $17 million to work with under the luxury tax. Actually, that's flipped. I beg your pardon. So Cleveland is hard capped because of the sign and trade that they just pulled off for Peyton Watson. And because of all the other shedding that they did, they've got quite a bit of flexibility here with that one open spot to add. Chicago, $40+ million under that first apron. The 76ers just got under it with the waiving of John Broom, and they're into the luxury tax. Portland, we'll see if they continue to do some tinkering, just like the Bucks. It's a roster that doesn't really seem to fit. And then the other big ones, Utah has quite a bit of flexibility. The Lakers still have some flexibility, but a full roster. Clippers, pretty similar there, and they're being even more frugal with Benedict Mathurin that you're hearing. It's basically the size of the qualifying offer is, from the sounds of it, what they would be offering him. So you look at those first two or those middle columns and you see, man, there's a lot of flexibility here, but the roster size. So look at all of those teams. We mentioned Memphis has 19, the Hawks have 17, the Hornets are at 18, the Bucks are technically at 16, but they got 17 guys that they're accounting for with Pete Nance's non-guaranteed deal. And that brings us over to this portion here where we look at overall league-wide. In total, there are 16 open roster spots. Not all of those have to be filled. That is the important thing to remember. So there's 450 players under standard contract at max throughout the year. You don't have to carry 450. That is just, or you don't have to reach that. That is just if every single team carries 15 players. So the minimum is 420 standard contracts. We're at 434. There are a handful of teams that have to do something. So again, 10 teams that need to add a player. So those are the teams that are at 13 roster spots. 17 teams can add a player. So those are teams that are at 13 or 14. So you can add that one. You can also stay good at 14. So it's 7 teams that are at 14 rosters. They can go into the season as is, or they could add one more. And then there's 5 teams that need to reduce. The Bucks are one of those 5 teams. And this is where it gets even more important for the next sheet that we're going to get into here is it's getting to be crunch time. And we've talked so much about, well, you can just do a 2-for-1, or you can do this. You can send this player here. You can absorb this guy. It's getting tougher to do that now that we're at the total that we're at. So technically, there is those 10 teams that need to add. The other 7 don't have to do anything. So that reduces who the Bucks could deal with down to a third of the league when you're talking about filling out your roster, unless you do something where you're sending out 3 and you're taking back 1, or you're sending out 3 and taking back 2, and then doing a separate corresponding move. It gets to be very complicated, which leads you into the end of the offseason, where we're already fastly approaching September, and it's starting to become more realistic. There is no additional trade here for the Bucks. We still got to see what happens with Jalen Duren. I think that's the big thing that is going to potentially be another domino for some of these teams. Although if Jalen Duren stays in Detroit, you remove that. I think the hope is if he goes somewhere else in a sign and trade, can you turn it into a larger trade? And can teams like the Bucks or teams like Memphis, even, who needs to offload, and Charlotte, can they get involved in that deal as well? But that's the big thing to focus on. So again, the green box and the red box, the no hard cap whatsoever. The red box is hard cap by the second apron. I don't expect much from any of those teams in there. Again, we'll take Toronto out of there and throw them in the first apron restriction, assuming Kawhi's deal goes through. That's 10 teams combined. They'd either have no hard cap or a hard cap at the second apron. I would be surprised if any of those 10 make a move of significance. That leaves you with 2/3 of the league that is facing this first apron hard cap. And while it does look like there's a ton of wiggle room in terms of the dollar figures that you see here in the first apron room column, the roster size is the more important one. And again, 17, 15, 18, 14. So in this group of 20 teams, you have the Cavs. Miami is technically at 14 now, but you have the Cavs, the Kings, the teams that absolutely have to add something here. That is what's going to make it more challenging and difficult than anything for the Bucks to make some type of trade and continue to tinker with their roster in this sense. So I have one more sheet to go through, and that is what is available financially for all 30 teams across the league, and how could that come into play? We'll get into that coming up next. All right, so financially, what's available? So here we put together a list of all the exceptions that are currently out there. So your non-tax mid-level, your tax mid-level, the biannual exception, and then trade exceptions and what is out there. This is what is left of the non-tax mid-level as well that teams have used. So a decent chunk of the league still has a portion of the non-tax mid-level available, or at least teams that had it to begin with. The Bucks have all of it. So you got the Wizards, the Blazers, the Bucks, and the Cavs as the teams that have the non-tax mid-level in totality available. But a decent chunk of these teams, so what, 15, half the league has it. The Warriors have less than $1 million, $500,000 basically, of their tax mid-level available, which is just over $6 million. Timberwolves have just under half of that available. The Knicks have about a third of it available. The Thunder have all of it available, and the Magic have most of it available. Then we move over to teams, so 5 that have a portion of the tax mid-level available. So here we're at 2/3 of the league has a portion of their tax or non-tax mid-level available. Then you have the biannual, and you can have multiples here. You can have a biannual and a non-tax, and so on. Most teams that had the biannual, so as it sounds, you get it every other year if you choose to use it, have most, if not all of it available. The Bucks have just under or just over half of it available. The Blazers have most of it available. And then you have the Spurs, Grizzlies, Clippers, Cavs, Hornets, Celtics, and Hawks with all of that basically $5 million biannual exception available. I think, given where we are in the offseason and the fact that the league, one of the more recent updates was you can basically use this as a trade exception and carry it into the season. I don't think you're seeing this used. I would be shocked. I would put the over-under at 1.5 and take the under on how many teams will use their tax. Actually, let's put it at 2.5 because if the Timberwolves are going to sign Jonathan Kuminga, it's going to be coming out, you would think, of their tax mid-level. 2.5, and I'll take the under on number of teams that use any of these three exceptions between now and the start of the season. And that brings us to the other category table here, and that is trade exceptions. So here is everything that is currently active with an expiration date, because you get a year to use your trade exception, and what the value is. And you can see the largest active trade exception belongs to the Grizzlies from that Jaren Jackson Jr. trade at last deadline or just before the deadline at just under $29 million. Actually, I take that back. The Hornets with LaMelo Ball's trade have a $40 million, just under $41 million trade exception. Keep an eye on Charlotte during the season. With that trade exception, if they want to get nuts, that's a team, based on how the young team comes together with this new look version of the team, that is a team to keep an eye on going into the first half of the season and how they perform and if they choose to use that in a rather sizable deal. Celtics have a big one as well with Anthony Simon's deal for Nikola Vucevic from last deadline. That expires in February. And again, your apron situation plays into all of this. So I should have put together a secondary column here to show you, can you currently use your trade exception? Because remember, depending on where you're hard capped means you can or can't use that. The Denver Nuggets, in theory, created a trade exception in that deal for to send Peyton Watson to the Cavs. They can't use it because of where they were currently capped with their restrictions. So that's another thing to point out here. But here's all the figures in terms of trade exceptions that are currently out there for all teams. And you can see a vast majority of them expire around February 5th, so right before the trade deadline, or right around July 6th of this upcoming summer for free agency. So my takeaway on all of it, and again, we're going to do a part 2 where Camille is going to join me, and we're going to go through some contracts that are out there and realistically, what, if anything, makes sense for the Bucks? What could we expect? But the point of all of this is kind of a primer, was to kind of level set, okay, here's where the league is as a whole. Here are the teams that are hard capped. Here's what they're hard capped by. Here's how much room they have. And then the bigger thing to me is this portion that we went through of league-wide rosters. There's only 16 spots that are open at max, right? That is just if we get to 450 players to start the season, which we didn't last year. We didn't the year before that. I don't think we will this year. That number is probably closer to 7, something like that, maybe less than that even, of jobs that are open is the way to think about that, and how it makes it even more challenging if you're the Bucks, right? Not just 16, Pete Nance. I think there's a decent chance you could get Pete Nance back on a 2-way, but is that a risk you want to take, right? Challenging for Memphis, who has to shed 4 contracts. Challenging for the Clippers. Challenging for the Hornets, who have to shed 3. For the Hawks, who still have to shed 2. So that number, more so than what you're hard capped at and how much wiggle room you have at this point in the offseason, to me is the most important, of how many jobs are actually open And I know that's the max of jobs that are open, but realistically, how many jobs are open and what can we expect to come from that there? So that's the primer on where we're currently at. Again, part two, if you will, of this. Camille is going to join me, and we're going to start to take a look at some contracts that would make sense for a team like the Bucks, and even teams like we've gone through here of Denver, if they're looking to continue to shed. Houston's an interesting one. I'm just going to file that one away because of what they're capped at, but how much wiggle room they have. And again, I'm just thinking out loud here, but Houston could always use some more shooting. They could absorb a contract that's about $10 million, and that would do the Bucks a favor there and create another trade exception for the Bucks as well. So we'll get into some of those potentially hypothetical deals or contracts we can start to look at for the Bucks. But my big takeaway is it's moving further to reality, if that makes sense. It's moving closer to the reality. May be you just have to waive a player, and Pete Nance's non-guaranteed contract just doesn't get guaranteed. And this is the team we're rolling into the season with. We'll figure it out as the season progresses. We've already heard a bit of messaging that the roster is going to look different at the end of the season than it does the beginning of the season. So I'm sure that goes into the thought process there as well. All right, look for part two. I believe we're going to release same day. So we're not making you wait and dragging you along here, but part two with Camille, where we get more specifically into contracts and hypotheticals we could look at for the Bucks. Send me your questions too. I know we ran through this relatively quickly and you followed along on screen, but feel free to send in your questions over figures, contracts, any of it, because I know, especially if you're new to the CBA and everything else, this can be a lot to go through. So by all means, leave your questions in the comments section, and Camille and I will start to address those on the next show as well. That's going to do it for today. Thanks as always for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day. We'll send you over to Locked On NBA for your second listen, where the gang keeps you up to date on everything. All of these things we just ran through: your contract negotiations, trade rumors, cap situations for all 30 teams. You stay up to date with the Locked On NBA show, which we'll send you to as soon as we wrap this up here. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Leave your questions about the cap, about being hard capped, about the biannuals, any of the trade exception stuff. Leave all your questions in the comments section. We'll address those and get into some hypotheticals coming up on our next show. That'll do it for today. We'll talk with you once again on Locked On Bucks.